The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Harwick Capital's downtown Toronto tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Lake Ontario, and on clear mornings, the water caught the light in a way that made the whole room feel suspended above the world. That morning was clear. Nobody was looking at the lake. They were looking at the man standing near the service cart by the door. He had come in to refill the water pitchers. That was all. That was the whole of his purpose in that room. And he had made the mistake of pausing, just for a moment. His eyes had moved, without meaning to the acquisition summary spread across the conference table, and Lorene Ashworth had noticed. Lorene Ashworth noticed everything. She was 61 years old, the CEO of Harwick Capital Management, and she had built her reputation over 3 decades on a single reliable instinct. She could read a room faster than anyone else in it. She knew when analysts were padding their numbers. She knew when board members were hedging. She knew always who in the room was the weakest and who was not paying attention. It was not cruelty exactly, it was precision. She looked at the man by the cart and then looked at the 8 people seated around her table, and something shifted in her expression. A small, private calculation, and she said, quite pleasantly, "Walter, why don't you take a look at this and tell us what you think?" The room went very still. Walter Drummond set the water pitcher down carefully. He was 58 years old, with gray at his temples and a pair of reading glasses folded in the breast pocket of his uniform shirt. The kind of gray polyester shirt that building services staff wore, with a small embroidered logo above the pocket. He had worked in the building for 4 years. Most people in the room had seen him dozens of times and could not have told you his name. "I'm sorry," he said. "The Meridian Group acquisition." Lorene gestured at the papers. "We're deciding whether to proceed. $47 million. You've been standing there long enough to read the headline. Go ahead." Someone at the table laughed. A short, uncomfortable sound, quickly swallowed. Stuart Caldwell, the head of mergers and acquisitions, leaned back in his chair with an expression of studied patience. He was the one who had spent 6 weeks on the Meridian file. He was the one who had authored the summary on the table. The joke, if it was one, was not particularly interesting to him. Walter looked at Lorene for a moment. There was nothing in his expression that could be called offense or embarrassment. He looked, if anything, slightly tired. "May I?" he said, and nodded toward the document. "Please," Lorene said. He walked to the table and picked up the summary. The room was quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when something has already become awkward and everyone is waiting for it to end. Stuart Caldwell glanced at his phone. Marcus, the junior analyst who had done most of the underlying research, studied the grain of the table. Walter read for approximately 90 seconds. Then he set the document down and said, "The liability structure on page 4 is going to be a problem." Stuart Caldwell looked up from his phone. "The Meridian pension obligations are listed as contingent," Walter said. "But the province changed the reporting classification for this category in the last fiscal year. If those obligations are reclassified as fixed, and a regulator almost certainly would, post-acquisition, you're looking at an additional 11 to 14 million in assumed liabilities that aren't priced into this offer." The room was very quiet now. The asset-to-debt ratio on page 7 accounts for neither that reclassification nor the subsidiary lease exposure in the Atlantic portfolio. Those are 2 separate issues, but they point to the same thing. The purchase price is based on a balance sheet that won't look the same 6 months after closing. Stuart Caldwell had put his phone face down on the table. Lorene Ashworth had not moved. She was watching Walter the way she watched analysts when she suspected they were about to be wrong or right, and she had not yet determined which. "What's your background?" she said. Walter folded his glasses back into his pocket. "Facilities management," he said. "I look after the 14th through 17th floors." He picked the water pitchers back up and finished his rounds and left. Walter Drummond had grown up in Sudbury, the son of a mining engineer and a school librarian, in a house where dinner conversation ran toward bond yields and the capital structure of nickel futures whether anyone wanted it to or not. His father had died when Walter was 19, and Walter had gone to work in the mines for 2 years before a guidance counselor at a night school talked him into applying to Queen's University on a mature student scholarship. He had finished a commerce degree in 3 years instead of 4, and then an MBA because someone suggested it, and he had not had a compelling reason to refuse. He had worked in financial services for 22 years, not as a teller or an administrator, but as a principal, first at a mid-sized fund in Ottawa, then at a boutique advisory firm he had co-founded in 2001. Drummond & Associates had, at its peak, managed assets in excess of $200 million for a client list that in several of the oldest family trusts in Ontario. He did not talk about any of this because it was not, in his view, anyone's business. The firm had wound down in 2016. Not from failure, the returns had been consistent, the clients largely satisfied, but because Walter's wife, Joanne, had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease, and the work of running a firm had become incompatible with the work of being her husband. He had sold his interest to his partners for considerably less than it was worth, and had spent 4 years as Joanne's primary caregiver. And when she died in the autumn of 2020, he had found that he did not know what to do with himself, or with money, or with the particular kind of quiet that a house becomes when one person is no longer in it. He had taken the facilities job at Harwick Capital, because the building was close to the apartment he had moved to, and because the work was physical and uncomplicated and required him to be present in his body rather than in his head. He had not intended to stay 4 years. He had not intended to do much of anything. He had not intended to say anything in that boardroom either. Stuart Caldwell found Walter in the service corridor on the 16th floor at noon, eating a sandwich from a paper bag and reading a worn copy of a book on Japanese urban planning that he had taken from the lobby's little community shelf. Stuart was 44 years old and had a runner's build and the kind of confidence that came from being right most of the time and knowing it. He had 3 advanced degrees and a list of closed transactions that was longer than most people's mortgage terms. He was not, generally speaking, a man who needed to find the building's maintenance staff to continue a conversation. "The pension reclassification," he said, without preamble. "Walk me through your reasoning." Walter closed his book and looked at Stuart the way a person looks at an interruption that is not, on reflection, entirely unwelcome. "You've read the Ontario Pension Benefits Act amendments from last April." "I've read them." The Meridian trustees filed their most recent actuarial report under the old classification framework. The amendments require transition reporting by end of calendar year. Any acquisition closing after January would trigger mandatory reclassification under the new framework. Walter unwrapped the second half of his sandwich. "Your legal team would catch it eventually. I assume they haven't looked at the pension schedule in detail yet." Stuart was quiet for a moment. "What's your name?" "Walter Drummond." "Stuart Caldwell." "I know who you are," Walter said. Stuart looked at him for a moment longer. Then he said, "Thank you," and went back upstairs. He spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with outside counsel. The thing about Laureen Ashworth was that she had not intended the moment in the boardroom to be cruel. That was, she understood, a fine distinction, and one that would not have provided much comfort to Walter, had he required comfort, which he gave no indication of doing. She had done it because she had a particular impatience with the performance of expertise, with the way her analysts sometimes sat in rooms and nodded at things they had not fully understood. And she had thought, in the moment, that it might be useful to introduce a variable. She had not expected the variable to identify a $14 million liability exposure. She asked her assistant to find out more about Walter Drummond. What came back surprised her, though she would not have admitted surprise to anyone who could use it. Marcus Caldwell, no relation to Stuart, had done the background research, and he had found it thorough. The Queen's degree, the MBA, the fund, the 22 years of transactions, the wind down, the caregiving years. He had also found the returns data from Drummond & Associates' final decade of operation, which had been reported to regulators and were therefore a matter of semi-public record. The numbers were not flashy. They were steady and they were correct, year after year, in a way that suggested someone who had been paying attention. Laureen read the report twice and then set it on her desk and looked out at the lake for a while. The next morning, she sent a short message to Stuart, asking him to extend an invitation to Walter Drummond for a brief conversation at his convenience. She did not say what the conversation would be about. Walter received the message on a Tuesday and thought about it for 2 days before responding. He was not by temperament someone who moved quickly toward things. He had learned, over the years, to let the shape of an offer become clear before he walked toward it, because offers that needed to be accepted quickly were usually offers that required you to not look too closely. He went up to the 42nd floor on a Thursday afternoon, still in his work clothes, because it had not occurred to him to change, and because he had decided that if the conversation required him to be someone other than who he currently appeared to be, it was not a conversation worth having. Laureen's assistant showed him in. The office was large and orderly, with a long credenza of dark wood, and a view that on clear days extended past the islands to the open water beyond. Laureen was standing when he came in, which Walter noted as a deliberate choice. "Mr. Drummond," she said, "thank you for coming." "You didn't say what you wanted to discuss," Walter said, sitting when she gestured toward the chairs. "I wanted to understand the pension issue more thoroughly. Stewart has been working with counsel to assess the reclassification exposure, and I'd like your perspective on the broader liability landscape before we make a final recommendation to the board." Walter looked at her. "I'm a building services employee." "Yes," Laureen said, "you are." A pause. "I've also read the Drummond & Associates regulatory filings from 2006 to 2016. Walter said nothing. "Your fund Sharpe ratio over that period was 1.4. That's not exceptional in a strong market. It's exceptional in the context of 2 recessions and a credit crisis." She opened a folder on her desk. "You consistently flagged regulatory reclassification risk as a material exposure in your client advisories. I found 3 separate letters to clients where you outlined exactly the kind of liability transition issue that exists in the Meridian file." "That was a different industry context," Walter said. "The principle is identical." The room was quiet for a moment. "What exactly are you asking me, Miss Ashworth?" Laureen closed the folder. "I'm asking whether you'd be willing to consult on the Meridian file. Formally, we would engage you as an independent advisor, paid at a rate commensurate with your background. The engagement would be specific to this transaction and could be expanded or concluded based on mutual preference." Walter looked at the lake for a moment. The light was gray that day, the water flat and dull. "Why?" he said. Laureen seemed to consider this. "Because you identified something in 90 seconds that 6 weeks of analysis missed, and because I have $47 million on the table and a board meeting in 3 weeks. That's a practical answer," Walter said. "I'm a practical person." Walter was quiet for a moment longer. "I'll think about it," he said, and stood and shook her hand and left. He thought about it for a week. He called his old partner, a man named Jeffrey Park. No, not Jeffrey, someone else. A man named Alan Sato, who had bought out Walter's interest in 2016 and had kept the client relationships warm for reasons Walter had never fully understood. Alan listened to the story and then laughed for a long time. "She called you in off the service cart," Alan said. "She didn't call me in. I happened to be there. She put you on the spot in a boardroom full of analysts." "Yes, and you caught a $14 million hole in their deal." "The hole was already there. I just read the document." "Walter," Alan said, "you have to do this." Walter drove home from that conversation along the lakeshore and sat in his apartment for a while with a cup of tea, looking at the photograph of Joanne on the bookshelf, the one from their trip to Newfoundland in 2008, where she was standing on a headland with the wind pulling her hair sideways, and she was laughing at something he had said that he could no longer remember. He had been careful, since she died, not to make decisions about the future while looking at that photograph, because it made him sentimental, and sentiment was not, in his experience, a reliable guide to anything. He looked at it anyway. Then he called Laureen Ashworth's office and said he would take the engagement. The Meridian file did not get simpler the closer Walter got to it. This was not surprising. In Walter's experience, the files that looked straightforward at summary level were frequently the ones that had accumulated the most unexamined complexity in their details, like sediment. You had to go slowly, and you had to be willing to be inconvenient. He worked from a small office on the 26th floor that Laureen's assistant had arranged. A spare room, mostly storage, with a window that looked into an interior light well and a desk that someone had pushed aside to make room for a filing cabinet. Walter had moved the filing cabinet himself and set up at the desk, and had not complained about any of it, which seemed to confuse the assistant slightly. He worked through the Atlantic subsidiary lease exposure that he had mentioned in the boardroom and found, as he had suspected, that it was more significant than the summary reflected. He found 3 additional pension subtrusts that had not been consolidated into the main liability schedule. He found a deferred tax position that had been carried forward under regulatory guidance that the province had quietly revised 18 months ago. He wrote it up in plain language, with sources cited and page references included, and sent it to Stewart. Stewart came down to the 26th floor the following afternoon. He pulled a chair up to the desk and they went through the document together for 2 hours, and at the end of it Stewart said, "If half of this holds up in due diligence, the offer price is wrong by at least 20 million. More like 23, Walter said. But I'd want outside counsel to validate the tax position before you say that in a board meeting." Stewart looked at him. "You don't want credit for this?" Walter looked back at him. "I want the analysis to be correct," he said. "That's different." There was a man on the M&A team named Marcus Caldwell, junior to Stewart, no relation, who had authored most of the original research and who had not reacted well to the implicit suggestion that his work had been incomplete. He was 28 years old and had an excellent academic record and a sharp defensive intelligence that had served him well in environments that rewarded defensiveness. He understood correctly that Walter's presence in the transaction reflected badly on his work. He did not understand, or had not yet learned, that this was not the most important consideration. Marcus began making inquiries. He was careful about it. He was always careful. And what he was looking for, initially, was some irregularity in Walter's history that might explain or undercut his credibility. It was not an admirable impulse, but it was a human one, and Marcus had not yet developed the judgment to distinguish between the two. He found the wind down of Drummond and Associates and looked at it from a particular angle, and he prepared a brief note for Stewart, suggesting that the firm's closure under ambiguous circumstances and Walter's subsequent years of unexplained employment history warranted scrutiny before his analysis was accepted. The note was not inaccurate. It was not exactly honest either. Stewart read it and sat with it for an afternoon, and then did something Marcus had not anticipated. He walked down to the 26th floor and showed it to Walter. "I want to give you the opportunity to respond," Stewart said. He looked uncomfortable in the way that people look uncomfortable when they are doing something they believe is right but would prefer not to have to do. Walter read the note. His expression did not change. "My wife was sick," he said. "She had Parkinson's disease. She died in 2020. I wound down the firm to take care of her." He folded the note and set it on the desk. "If Marcus would like to verify that, the estate records are public, and Joanne's physicians are no longer bound by privacy obligations." Stewart was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry about your wife," he said. "Thank you," Walter said. "The note won't go further." "That's your decision," Walter said. "The analysis stands on its own. Whether you use it is also your decision." Stewart took the note when he left, and Walter did not ask what he did with it. He heard later that Marcus had been moved off the Meridian file and assigned to a regulatory review project in another division. No one told him why, and he did not ask. The board meeting was held on a Wednesday in late November, when the first real snow of the year had come down overnight and left the city with that particular quiet that fresh snow produces. A muffled, provisional stillness, as though the world had decided to wait a moment before continuing. Walter was not in the meeting. He had not expected to be, and had not asked to be. He had submitted his analysis as a supporting document to the board package, and had noted in the cover memo that the conclusions were his own and should be independently validated, and that he was available for questions. He was filling a supply cart on the 17th floor when Laureen's assistant found him at 10:30 and said that Ms. Ashworth would like him to come up. He came up. The board was still in session but had taken a short break, and Laureen was standing near the window with a coffee cup in her hand, looking at the snow-covered city below. She turned when he came in. "The board has decided to revise the offer," she said. "We're renegotiating the price based on your liability analysis. The Meridian principals are not happy, but they're not walking away." Walter nodded. "They've also asked about the source of the analysis," Laureen said. "There were some questions about its provenance." "What did you tell them?" "I told them it was the work of an independent advisor with 22 years of relevant experience." She paused. "Which is accurate. Also accurate," Walter said, "is that the advisor currently manages your building's janitorial supply inventory for floors 14 through 17. Also accurate," Laureen agreed. She looked at him for a moment. "I'd like to offer you a consulting retainer. Ongoing. Not just for this transaction." Walter looked at the snow on the city below. There was a particular clarity to the way the buildings looked in fresh snow. Washed clean, edges distinct, nothing obscured. "That's a significant change," he said. "It is. I'd want to keep my current position for the remainder of the month. There are some things on the 17th floor that need to be wrapped up before anyone else takes over." Lorene looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise. She had encountered enough unusual things in her career to have largely surrendered to being surprised. But something adjacent to it, something that might, in a different setting, have been called respect. "Of course," she said. "I'll want the engagement to be structured as an independent contractor arrangement," Walter said. "I don't do well with hierarchies." "I've noticed," Lorene said. He finished out the month on the 17th floor. He made sure the supply rotations were documented clearly for whoever would take over. He left a note on the service cart with the quirks of the freight elevator, because it had a pressure sensitivity issue on the door close that could trap a cart if you weren't paying attention, and he didn't want anyone to find that out the hard way. On his last morning in the building services role, he took the freight elevator to the lobby and walked out through the loading dock, as he had done every morning for 4 years, and stood for a moment in the cold air of the December morning. He was not, by temperament, someone who looked back at things. He had learned, over the years, that the past had a way of becoming very heavy if you picked it up and carried it, and that it was often better to let it rest where it had come to rest, and simply walk in whatever direction seemed honest and forward-facing. But he stood there for a moment anyway, in the cold, watching the steam rise from a vent in the loading dock concrete, thinking about Joanne and about the years of careful, patient, unglamorous work that a life tended to accumulate if you let it. The years that people didn't see and wouldn't think to ask about, the years that looked from the outside like nothing much at all. He had not needed anyone to see them. He had done them because they were what was required and what was right, and because there was a kind of dignity in being equal to the actual demands of your actual life, regardless of whether those demands were glamorous or whether anyone was watching. He put his hands in his coat pockets and walked to where his car was parked, a 2009 Civic that he kept in good mechanical condition but had never seen a reason to replace, and he drove home along the lakeshore, and the lake was gray and wide and flat and very still. 2 weeks later, he sat down at the desk in his apartment and drafted the consulting framework document that he and Lorene's legal team had been negotiating. It was thorough and professionally structured and contained several provisions that the lawyers had initially pushed back on, all of which Walter had declined to remove. He had been doing this long enough to know which provisions were in there for a reason. He signed it and sent it, and then made himself a cup of tea and sat for a while in the quiet of the apartment. The photograph of Joanne was still on the bookshelf, still on the headland in Newfoundland, still laughing at the thing he couldn't remember. He thought, looking at it, that she would have found the whole story very funny. The boardroom, the water pitcher, the $47 million acquisition with a $14 million hole in it, the look on everyone's faces. She had always been better at finding things funny than he was. He drank his tea and opened his laptop and began reading the next file Lorene had sent him. It was a proposed acquisition of a logistics company with operations in 3 provinces, and even in the executive summary he could already see where the complexity was hiding. He found a pen and started making notes in the margin. Some things, once you knew how to read them, simply could not be unread.